with the Nigerian government, Marion Jansen, economist at ITC, Pierre, Sauvé with the World Bank and many other great institutions before that. Hong Song is with CAS in China, Kati Suominen, serial entrepreneur, and focusing on e-commerce aspects in Latin America and around the world. So I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Felipe Sandoval, who's going to facilitate and moderate the session. And I hope you enjoy it, because we've been working with all of these people, and they're full of good ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. I just want to make sure that the microphone is working and everyone can hear me. Is it working? Okay. It is? Great. This is the way we're going to do our panel. I'm going to ask everybody but Pierre to begin with a short pitch, a 2-minute introduction to what they're going to say afterwards. So the first pitch will be on the far left with Kati, and from Kati we'll move to Marion. Kati, you have the floor.
Well, thanks very much. Since I go first, I'll introduce the topic a little bit. What we're seeing in data is that e-commerce is a great enabler for companies to export and grow international. I've been doing a lot of survey work and seeing over and over that companies that sell online are much likelier to export to many markets, and grow faster than offline sellers. So it's a great growth opportunity. I'm quite convinced of that. If we want to really help developing countries to pursue that and catalyze e-commerce development in those countries, number one thing is we have to prioritize. There's a lot to do. We could focus on connectivity. We could focus on online payments. We could focus on logistics. You name it. There's a number of elements in the enabling environment that Andrew was referring to that have to go right in order for e-commerce to flourish. But we should prioritize and focus on those that are the binding constraints in any one country. And every country has a different set of those challenges. The second thing that I'll elaborate more on is once we understand the challenges, what do we do? And there is a need for new thinking and kind of outside the box thinking of how do we revise, for instance, antiquated customs regulations and so forth to accommodate the digital economy. But we also have a lot of examples and kind of learning to do from what already exists. There is a lot of examples from the developed countries and countries like Singapore on how to do fintech regulations or payment regulations to accommodate e-commerce. We have wonderful examples from countries like Brazil on how to further the interoperability of payments in the domestic economies and so forth. So I think that's very much a merit to taking a look what already exists and learning from those experiences. And then the third area is a little bit more kind of bigger and abstract that I think we want to focus on, not just focus on kind of capacity building in different sectors or different countries, but also think about the kind of ecosystem and the global trade ecosystem. How do we digitize trade finance, logistics, the exporters and importers, the whole supply chain, if you will, the entire trade ecosystem, and induce interoperability among these different players so that the international trade ecosystem and intermediaries work seamlessly together to advance e-commerce. And I think that will also raise kind of all boats as we have a better, more digitized trade ecosystem.
Thank you, Kati. Marion.
Yeah, following up on Kati, at ITC, we also see that there's a lot of opportunities for companies, in particular our clientele, small and medium-sized enterprises, to take advantage from e-commerce. But we also see that SMEs face significant bottlenecks. We find in our survey work that only 20% of the companies we survey do e-commerce. And of those who don't do it, 65% in developing countries have considered to do it. So they've thought about it and for some reason didn't manage. I will talk in the follow-up about the kind of bottlenecks we identify at the firm level, in the ecosystem, or at the national, international level that SMEs encounter. We find that often SMEs have capacity problems at the firm level when it comes to only going online, establishing business. At the level of e-payments or getting produce across the border, we find the main bottlenecks at the ecosystem, in particular the ability to connect to international logistic platforms or e-payment platforms. When it comes to after sales, we see a lot of work that needs to be done at the national regulatory level, notably, and on information provision. Maybe to provoke a bit of discussion, I wonder whether some of these issues should be addressed in parallel, not only one after the other. In ITC, we work along several lines at the same time with our offering on e-learning, e-strategies, and e-solutions, and I will say a bit more about that in the follow-up.
Fantastic. Thank you, Marion. Now's the turn of Constance, please.
Okay, so I'm going to start by giving a very short story. About a year and a half ago, when I started working with the ministry, my boss in interviews kept saying that Nigeria wants to move up on the World Bank ease of doing business by at least 20 places. And each time he said it, I was a little bit jittery because I was like, this is so specific. What happens if you don't get to that target? That means probably reporters would eat me for lunch because they would say, your boss said this and you were not able to achieve this. But now, a year and a half now, the last ranking was done and we moved up 24 places. I'm telling this story to connect it to what it means to be determined and what it means to work on enabling business environment, whether it's in the industrial sector, whether it's in the e-commerce, because now we're developing a digital economy strategy which takes into consideration the problems and challenges that are being faced by people in that area. So what I'm saying essentially is that we have moved up and we have been able to remove some bottlenecks and barriers that are facing businesses in different areas. Starting a business, having a one-stop shop where you can go to and sort of have most of the problems solved or you be attended to. So this is what we're also going to do when it comes to e-commerce. And I'm going to be touching on what we see as our national strategy and what we see as what the country can gain from the sector, from the e-commerce, in the sense that we think it has a potential to create a lot of jobs for our population and whatever else that comes up for discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you, Constance. And now we'll pass on to Hong, please.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to come here. And I would focus on the case of China. And the e-commerce in China is like revolutions recently, a lot of changes. Why this e-commerce revolutions happen in China? I think there is several reasons for that, mainly because the traditional transaction cost is very high. So it's revolutionary to change it by the e-commercials, by business models and a lot of things, and payment, and also even for the innovations for that. So also have a lot of the implications for that, because because of the traditional transaction cost is very high in China. So we get some lessons for this, and maybe can be shared by other countries, especially by developing countries. And in terms of other policies, of course, because China's e-commerce development in China is only happened because in the last 20 years as well, China is economically take off in terms of industrialization processes. And also this ITC revolutions is together to help China to take advantage of these ITC revolutions and get integrated, and also have some experience can be shared by other developing countries.
Thank you very much, Hong. That was a nice speech. Now, after everyone's introduction, I'm going to ask Pierre to initiate the longer section of this panel by framing our conversation once again. And the floor is all yours. Please.
Thank you, Felipe. We're being filmed, correct?
Yes, we are.
So this is not Chatham House rules. No. So I have to be careful. Yes. Okay. It's not easy for me to be careful. It's not my DNA. That's not how I roll. Well, I'll try. I'll try to be. Can you just cut the camera for a second? Just forget that part, the role part, and then. Okay. Now, I thought I would provide some context on where we are. I mean, we're trying, or many members of the WTO are trying to advance an agenda on e-commerce multilaterally. If you were crazy enough to sit in the plenary yesterday and listen to 164 speeches, you would have heard on time and again the necessity that WTO members seem to feel for the membership to embrace this technological revolution, to do something about it, because it is transforming the way we do business, it's transforming the relationship between governments and citizens, it's transforming our lives both as producers and consumers and citizens and so on. And yet we know how difficult that journey is proving to be. So I thought I'd provide some context on, why is this the case and what lies behind some of these difficulties, and what can we realistically expect trade policy and trade governance to bring to this conversation. How trade-centric should digital governance be? It seems to me that's a question that doesn't get asked very often, and yet it seems relevant to me. The first observation I would make is that this train, this digital train, is in motion. And so there is a risk of not being on it that flows from the professed reluctance, whether tactical or legitimate, of a large number of developing countries to refuse to engage. There is that risk. At the same time, there is a paradox, because I work for the World Bank Group. Every day of every year, in every country in which we operate, we work on digital issues. Every interaction we have with trade ministers places digital connectivity and all that flows from it almost at the summit or at the summit of domestic reform priorities and of trade policy priorities. And so it's very difficult to reconcile what is happening in capitals, what is happening in country, where developing countries are embracing in a very active manner both the software reforms and the hardware reforms, the connectivity and the rulemaking. Every country I've been to, every country I work in, is working on those issues, is working on developing cybersecurity laws, and working on making sure that submarine cables come to their nations to increase broadband and so on. So there is this paradox of this unilateral national embracing of the transformative properties of this agenda and the refusal to assign to trade policy making multilaterally a role in speeding up these reforms, supporting these reforms, complementing these reforms, addressing elements of the reform process that cannot be addressed domestically because perhaps the elements, the barriers are actually in other markets. This paradox is puzzling to me, this disconnect between domestic priorities, affirmed domestic priorities, and the negotiating stances that a lot of developing countries take. Now, why do they take these positions? Partly, it's completely tactical. The Doha round, I would say, suffering from, if you can stop filming me, Doha round delusion. There is an element of that, and so countries who cling to the belief that we must absolutely conclude the Doha round on the basis upon which it was meant to be concluded, tactically refuse because they feel they have some coinage there that is useful to them. Other countries who refuse to embrace this agenda perhaps hide behind both tactical considerations of that nature, but also oligarchic, I would say, concerns of protecting domestic rents. Some countries are just very comfortable in the regulatory status quo that currently prevails. It is supremely ironic that India, one of the champions of e-commerce and of IT-related services, steadfastly opposes any conversation of this issue in a multilateral setting. And you have to wonder, how does that make sense? What does that convey by way of concerns about perhaps seeing first mover rents eroded through MFN-based discussions. And then there is, of course, the very genuine capacity constraints that a lot of countries face. Despite the fact that everybody is working on it, every country is trying to engage in this area, there are still some very deep divides, digital divides, connectivity divides, digital literacy divides, that of course hold back the ability to take advantage of these transformative changes. So I think we have to be subtle in the way we analyze and understand what lies behind the current impasse on these issues at the WTO. Now, another point I would want to make is, and I'll come back to the capacity constraints in a second, the other point I would want to make is uncertainty, at least in my view, about what can and should be assigned to trade policy in developing a digital trade governance response, a digital governance response, if you want. How much of digital governance fits into the province of what trade negotiations and trade policy does, and how much of it fits outside of trade policy in other institutions, in other processes that, for lack of an appropriate anchor, we're trying to fit into a trade policy context. There's no doubt that there are elements of the e-commerce digital trade agenda that raise some very nuts and bolts issues of trade diplomacy. There are barriers to the cross-border movement of data flows that require some rulemaking. There are localization requirements whose impact on cross-border activity will be affected. There's a gradient. Some localization requirements, in my view, are perfectly legitimate. Others may well be a disguised restriction to trade driven by industrial policy concerns. We need trade disciplines to be able to establish where that cursor lies. And what is the trade discipline that we typically develop to do that? A test of necessity. Who are the countries who don't want necessity tests in the WTO? Primarily the countries that tend to champion e-commerce. So there is yet another paradox there. The WTO can do a lot and is already doing a lot in addressing border impediments to the movement of the equipment that gives meaning to e-commerce. The ITA and the Trade Facilitation Agreement are essential trade policy responses to expanding the contribution of e-commerce and digital trade to development. But there are other issues that are clearly part of the landscape. Paperless trade, source code regulations, privacy, and so on, consumer protection issues, electronic signatures, encryption technology, cybersecurity rules. Are those rules that fit into the traditional province of what we understand to be trade policy? Is the WTO going to be the place where we discuss the technical details of regulations in these areas? We have never done that anywhere, not in telecoms. When we did the basic telecoms agreement, the province of the WTO is to say, is the measure transparent? Is it discriminate? Is it necessary to achieve compliance, secure compliance with the legitimate public policy objective? Is it potentially disproportionate or a disguised restriction to trade? And so, again, because we have nowhere to really discuss digital trade issues institutionally at a global level, we lump everything into the WTO, and in so doing, my fear is that we might run into some mission creep issues that will make the membership a bit reluctant to embrace. There's two more points and I'm finished.
That's fine.
One is what are we talking about, or what should we be talking about? E-commerce, which has been what we've been talking about for 19 years, and I think the work in the different working groups has more or less established beyond reasonable doubt that the membership is interested in this issue. No? 19 years of discussions seems to suggest today that, yes, we seem to think there's a critical mass of understanding that we have to do something about this. But are we organized in a coherent way in pursuing this agenda? And there are some, I think, very interesting proposals to say, let's break down these vertical silos that separate the goods and services and development and IP dimensions of this agenda into what we know will have to be a coherent, comprehensive approach. I mean, resisting that, which is the case of a lot of WTO members, is again completely absurd, completely driven by non-substantive tactical posturing. This issue is complex, it's multi-layered, it will probably need to command a multi-layered institutional response, a multi-layered governance response. The WTO is not going to solve all these problems. A lot of the technical regulations that apply to issues like cybersecurity and so on are going to have to be transacted outside of the WTO. Otherwise, we're going to transform the WTO into a regulatory body, which it is not, and has never been and is not designed to be. My final observation is going back to capacity. I don't understand how refusing to engage in negotiations helps developing countries who lack capacity, who have genuine bottlenecks, and need to address them, and therefore need to see an increased supply of technical assistance on the part of the donor community. And I think if we look to the experience of the trade facilitation negotiations, we find both procedurally and substantively elements of response that should make countries a bit more sanguine about the idea of perhaps entertaining the thought of a negotiating mandate in the WTO. Because what did the TFA do? A, it put the finger on a very significant source of bottlenecks that was depriving countries from the full benefits of the commitments they were making and the commitments that others were making to open their markets. And that anchor generated a massive increase in TRTA, in trade-related technical assistance. For the World Bank alone, 2004, when the trade facilitation negotiations began, we were spending $400 million a year on trade facilitation-related assistance. Today, 14 years later, we are spending $7 billion a year, a multiple of almost 20, 18 to be perfectly honest. And that would not have happened without the anchoring aspect of a negotiation that crystallized the minds of the development community and of the trade community. So by refusing to engage, it seems to me, but this is my personal view, not that of the World Bank, I speak here in my own capacity, I think a lot of developing countries are sort of underestimating the opportunity cost of non-engagement, underestimating the technical assistance response that would come from having a negotiating anchor. And unlike trade facilitation, which was mostly about infrastructure, which is typically the province of multilateral and regional development banks and the government, supplying infrastructure is not really a thing markets do on their own, except under PPP contracts. In the case of e-commerce and digital trade, I would be willing to bet that the technical assistance response is going to be a multiplier effect, not only that of the donor community, but also the response of the private sector that has an interest in seeing that there is greater connectivity around the world. My final point is about the alleged fear that if we engage in these negotiations, we're going to be dominated by 4 or 5 essentially American companies. I come from Canada. We haven't produced any of those companies. They're all American. No? Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, none of them are Canadian. But is Canada benefiting? And of course, I forget the Chinese ones that are becoming relatively big of late. You know, there are just a couple of countries that have companies of that magnitude. is that preventing other countries from exploiting the power of the internet as a source of B2B and B2C transactions? I mean, I finish with one observation. My son, oldest son, just moved from Paris to Berlin to take up a new job. He was leaving his apartment and said, I want to sell my furniture. I want to buy new stuff in Germany. The company's not paying for my removal. He put all of his goods on not eBay, not some American website, no, Au Bon Coin, good old French website. Within 4 days, he sold everything he owned. And so this notion that somehow, if we embrace this negotiation, it's going to translate into world domination by 4 companies, it makes for great sort of urban legends, but it is simply not the way things are. And I think we have to look at that. Let's use those platforms where they exist to connect companies and consumers, but let's not underestimate the fact that in most countries, countries are capable, perfectly capable, of building their own platforms that connect producers and consumers, sellers and buyers, including in geographically remote regions. And that fear of domination is yet one more excuse that I just find lacks any compelling substantive merit. Let me end there.
Thank you very much, Pierre. I think we all had a fairly good introduction to what's coming. Now, if I were to identify maybe 3, 4 points or main pillars of your intervention, I say first is the scope of WTO law. What falls within WTO and what falls outside the WTO? Even if that line were to be drawn with respect to a single topic, as e-commerce, for example. Second, a comprehensive approach in case that there was going to be a negotiation on e-commerce at a broad plurilateral level or at a multilateral level. With this negotiation, only have to address services-related issues, which are, by large, what the world of e-commerce is all about, or would it have to address other issues falling within the realm of other areas of trade? Third pillar, the development dimension to this. What about trade assistance? What about looking at the example of the TFA, not just from the mechanical point of view of how it's going to be implemented, but really looking into the driving principles behind the deal of the TFA. And as a fourth point, I think it was very interesting to really revisit the idea of this rather unjustified fears, which in many occasions seem to be gathered by some as a justification not to engage, as to simply raise the levels of fear and then of reluctance. So that said, and thank you again, Pierre, we'll move on to you, Kati. And if you take into account the presentation by Pierre, what do you think would be the kinds of rules, domestic and international rules, that would help, in particular, small and medium-sized enterprises, which is the business of Nextrade, to develop in this new economy, digitized economy?
Great, thanks so much. Let me put it a little bit in context. We have some survey work that I've done in my firm, now covering probably 4,000 different companies, small, mid-sized, as well as large companies in about 20 different developing countries. And this was supported by USAID, and now I'm having a chance to build this out with Pierre and his group at the World Bank further. And what we find over and over is that in every country, companies that are offline sellers tend to export much less than companies that are online sellers. 20% of companies that are offline sellers are kind of brick-and-mortar companies that don't sell online export, whereas 60% of small businesses that are online tend to export. With large companies, the numbers are 30% versus 90%. So it seems that in every size category, for any company, e-commerce is good, selling online is good if they are seeking to export and grow their exports and diversify across different markets. Now, when you ask these companies, well, what are your challenges? What should the regulations, are regulations a challenge? Are access to finance a challenge? Is logistics a challenge? And so on. There seems to be a rank ordering of certain challenges in the enabling environment for e-commerce that need to be addressed, I think, if we want to really push this forward. One is access to finance, particularly for small companies, access to finance, whether it is trade finance for cross-border e-commerce or more for working capital or digital finance when dealing with domestic markets seems to be a huge issue. Logistics is another big issue. Therein, last mile delivery, particularly in rural areas, and customs issues stand out. Business regulations, kind of the overall doing business environment that World Bank's doing business catalogs is another big impediment for companies to do e-commerce and take advantage of platforms and so forth. And then certainly, indeed, digital regulations seem to be an emerging concern for companies that are seeking to do e-commerce or already doing it. And among those are things like online copyright rules, legal liability for internet intermediaries, data privacy rules, taxation of digital sales, and so on. The list goes on. And it seems to be, in just about every country, digital regulations are a growing concern. It's typically a top three concern for countries, for companies across the board, for small, mid-size, and large. And to echo what Pierre was saying about these large American companies setting the agenda, what I've been struck by in this survey work is that small developing country companies articulate very much the same priorities for digital regulations as well as other areas as do Google or eBay or American companies. I think the agendas are very aligned, and if developing countries want to be serious about helping their own SMEs, they need to pay attention to what their SMEs are saying, but also very much what the Western companies are saying there. What I come away with when I look at these results from this data is that there is no cookie-cutter solution. We need to customize interventions for any one country. So if it is indeed that we want to do more capacity building and technical assistance to countries, then we need to look at what the priorities are in any one country or in any one business segment. It could be that for countries that want to focus on micro-enterprises, the priorities are very different than for countries that want to focus on helping middle-market companies grow through e-commerce. So there are those issues that vary very much across countries and across companies that we want to be mindful of. But it seems that these issues matter to companies. When you ask them, well, how much would your exports grow? How much would your productivity grow? How many more people would you employ? Companies, if these issues were resolved, that companies complain about, the top three issues for them. It seems that companies across the board, on average, say that 30% increases, they would score 30 to 35% increases in exports, about 28% increases in productivity or production, and a good 28% increases in employment. So these are very significant numbers. I think very much. It's a very worthwhile activity to address these through capacity building. So then the question is, well, if these are the challenges, what is the roadmap? What do we then do? What are the best models that developing countries, say in Africa or Southeast Asia or here in Latin America, should emulate? Who is the kind of global best practice, or is there one country? What can we learn from? I get this question all the time when I present these findings from this survey work in different countries as diverse as Kenya or Bangladesh or Mexico or Turkey. I've been speaking in all of these, and this is the number one question that comes up. What is the best global best practice that my country should follow? What should I emulate? Is it Brazil? Is it Singapore? Who is the best practice? And we're right now working on answering this. We have a set of US companies have formed an alliance for e-trade development with USAID, and our first job is to map out what different countries are doing in such areas as digital regulations or payment regulations, SME export promotion for e-commerce, SME credit. And we're mapping all these out in great detail. There's probably 40, 50 areas across 40 countries or so around the world, in order to produce some kind of a roadmap for countries and a bird's eye view of what are other countries doing, but then also give countries some priorities. What are the global best practices we're seeking to get to that through using data from e-commerce platforms. So that should be ready in the next few months, at least the first cut, and look forward to sharing more of that, and hopefully we'll produce something useful for many countries, including at the WTO. The final, the couple of other areas to highlight still. I think in Aid for Trade, there are some very useful lessons for this area of e-commerce development. And what I think we need to do as we're pursuing capacity building in this space is to do evaluations, proper project evaluations, as well as run, what we have done in Aid for Trade is run econometrics to understand what is the impact of every dollar of aid to a developing country's trade. And furthermore, if possible, to understand the implications to poverty reduction and such. And we do see that, you know, investments, as Pierre's organization have done, have produced a very significant benefit for developing countries, but also for the donors that have made those investments in the donor countries' exports to developing countries. And I think these are very essential for us to continue making in e-commerce, to understand what is the impact of capacity building, what is the impact of dollars invested, and perhaps do it even better than in Aid for Trade, where there are some gaps in assessing at the project level the impact of different interventions. So we can kind of upgrade that work here in this space. And I think we want to also look very objectively evidence as to what extent e-commerce does reduce poverty and to what extent it catalyzes job creation in microenterprises. I'm not sure we have that empirical evidence quite yet in, and that's something that is probably worth doing. The final thing that I mentioned very briefly in the introduction is, perhaps we want to think about capacity building and technical assistance, not only in terms of countries or sectors, but also more systemically, and thinking about the global trade ecosystem. What we are seeing is that kind of global physical supply chains, when you think of warehouses, logistics, trucks, ships, port systems, are becoming much more digitized, and they are starting to interoperate also well with one another. So you have experiments like the Port of Hamburg, where Internet of Things applications kind of run the show and help trucks and ships and the port system to coordinate activities. And these have tremendous efficiency gains, and I think as we are getting to helping companies in developing countries, these interventions to produce similar effects are very necessary. And furthermore, to do the same in the financial and informational supply chains. We're still in a world where even the biggest banks use analog letters of credit. Bit by bit, we're starting to see changes. Banks are using digital letters of credit. They are using the shippers and others in the trade community are using electronic bills of lading. We're having kind of blockchain interventions and experiments, pilots around the world. And as these go forward, I think there's a role for creating further interoperability among the different players that are digitizing. And this is something that I've been working on with a number of banks and financial services. In Singapore, we are actually establishing an institute to create standards among the different digitizing trade ecosystem players to fuel interoperability and lower the cost for everybody to participate in trade. So as e-commerce becomes more of just normal trade, this is where the world is going. Soon enough, we don't talk about e-commerce. Trade is e-commerce. I think these kinds of system-level interventions to lower the cost for everybody who is participating in trade are very necessary and kind of the next era of capacity building. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kati. That was quite interesting. May I just say, what I've always admired about your work and Next Trade is the fact that you do not only produce data, you also ask a lot of questions. And those questions eventually lead to new solutions and new questions, of course. Your almost last point on what should be the new phase of trade assistance. How do we move forward? I think that it's an excellent starting point for Marion Jansen from ITC. ITC being all about the real world of entrepreneurs in developing nations.
Yes, indeed, we are very active in the area of trade-related technical assistance. I think my head of agency likes to say we are the only agency that is 100% aid for trade. That's what we are about. And our main target group is the private sector, are small and medium-sized enterprises and institutions that help small and medium-sized enterprises. So we have a standard way of assessing what creates bottlenecks, what are challenges for SMEs to start doing international business, and have been working along these lines for many years. This area of e-commerce, artificial intelligence, the digital world, has led us to think about the need to develop new tools that are specific to this area of work. And we have also, therefore in this context, also developed a survey to understand better what we need to develop in terms of answers. But maybe one difference between the questions we ask and the ones some of the questions Kati has been asking is that we focus in our survey purely on the e-commerce side. So we do not ask questions, what do you need more access to finance? That's part of our traditional work on SME competitiveness. And if you're interested in the findings of this, of our survey, look for this paper, you find it in front of the door. Everything is summarized in this small little piece. It's nevertheless a lot. What we did in order to develop this paper and to find answers is that we did a mix of our standard way of approaching SME competitiveness and looking at e-commerce. We at ITC assume that competitiveness depends on 3 layers in the economy. It depends on the national rules and also on whether these rules speak to other rules abroad. That's what is typically discussed in forums like the WTO. It depends on what we call the big business ecosystem. This is the ecosystem directly around the firm that may be sectorial or regional or local, not necessarily national. And it depends on the firm itself. So we look for every area we are interested in. We look at what happens at the firm level, what happens in the ecosystem, and what happens at the national level. And when we work on e-commerce, we are testing 4 parts of what we call the e-commerce process chain. We look at what is necessary in order to establish a business online, what is necessary to conduct e-payment, what is necessary to get produce across the border, and what is necessary to serve your client also after sales. And we look at each of the layers of the economies here. I will give you some hints about the findings, but maybe to provoke a bit, we find some differences there are some differences with points that Kati made or Pierre made. We find, for instance, that issues like de minimis, the topic at the WTO, are not of concern to many SMEs in developing countries, or they don't know what it is. And they don't know what it is about because most of SMEs in the developing world do not bring their good across the border. They use logistics companies for this. They use services providers for this. And it's the services provider who is exposed to de minimis problems. When we ask about data localization, very important topic in the global discussion, it's an issue that companies in the industrialized world are concerned about. In the developing world, we don't hear a lot of concern about this. So we see differences across regions. A difference with Pierre, we do find that there may be concerns about market power at different parts of that process chain. Market power when it comes to putting your business online, There are few global players, but actually hardly any global players. We see players being regional or national. Alibaba active in China, eBay active in Americas, and from there expanding. E-payment, a big market concentration there, maybe the biggest market concentration in this chain. Logistics, market concentration there too. If you have a longer chain, so much accumulation of market power, as an economist, I think it's something you have to start looking at. So this, as far as the differences, when I go to more general findings, as I said already before, 65% of the companies who are not online have tried to go online and did end up not doing it. We see a lot of concern at the firm side of not being able to understand how to represent their products online and how to make products visible abroad, and very traditional, not knowing what they can sell where. Many companies, once they try to go online, they realize e-commerce is not a magic bullet. You need to be able to do business in order to do business online. And the same problem they have in ordinary business, they will encounter online too. So when it comes to going online, starting to set up the business, we see, maybe we would say the main bottlenecks at the firm level is a lot of need for capacity building there. When it comes to e-payment, we see the biggest bottlenecks at in what we call the business environment level, where it's platforms of services providers that have to speak to each other and don't. National banking systems often not being connected to international e-payment providers. International e-payment providers not certifying, not allowing in its discussions directly with finance ministries often for the country to get access to its services. So there, a lack of connectivity among services providers. When it comes to getting goods across the border, often SMEs in developing countries use other logistics providers. We see big differences between the developing and the developed world when it comes to the costs of getting things through the border. When we ask of what share of your final price comes from the costs of logistics, that share is double in developing countries than in developed countries. So there's a lot of potential to reduce costs, and there are issues like trade facilitation agreement can play an important role. After sales, serving the client protection, that's a total black box for SMEs in developing countries. They often say we don't even know which rule applies. Many companies are surprised that products are returned back, don't know which taxes apply, and do not understand which cost this involves for them. That's a big issue. We find that in LDCs, often close to 10% of goods are returned. Again, double the percentage of developed industrialized countries. And it's partly because of the problem mentioned before, they don't know how to go online. So they represent something online what is not what the client gets at the end, and then the client returns it back. If companies do not account for the costs of return goods in their initial business plan, and 10% of the goods come back, then a small company can go bankrupt. So that's an important issue that they have to be informed about, and they have to learn how to deal with these issues. Now, we believe that at that area, there is a lot more that can be done at the national policy level, also with regulations speaking to each other, which consumer rights is being applied, that of the destination country, the home country, do they speak to each other? In this area, I think there are interesting developments. It's in I think it's a TPP agreement in the e-commerce chapter where the word consumer protection appears. When I joined the WTO 20 years ago, I did a search for the word consumer in the WTO legal texts. The term consumer didn't appear. Where most of us here will believe that trade is above all useful, good for consumers, but the term doesn't appear in the agreements. Now consumer protection is appearing. I think that's an interesting development. We see also developments in some of the regional agreements of making reference to other bodies. As Pierre said, not all the rules that are necessary in the context of e-commerce should maybe be set at the WTO. Maybe there are other bodies where rules will be set. If that's the case and we want a coherent system, we need these legal texts to talk to each other. That's traditionally a difficult field for the WTO. The first references we are seeing is references to UNCITRAL legal texts about electronic contracts, which ones we should stick to. So I think there are interesting developments there. I think the ICT's work is useful in understanding what kind of bottlenecks exist in which part of the economy and how to overcome them. I would join the others in saying this is an area that all players should embrace, and ideally not because of fear and because of problems stay away from it. And one reason is because I think that while there may be a digital divide, there is a rule-making divide that is much less profound than we may think. Rule-making on e-commerce, on digital, is new for everybody. In another session here in Buenos Aires, I said, my country, Germany, we have 500 years of experience in setting regulation on beer and sausages. When it comes to e-commerce digital, this is new for Germany, this is new for the United States, for Japan, Rwanda, Kenya, China. This is an area where we can all catch up together, and I therefore would like to encourage everybody to take this theme up and to start working on it.
Thank you very much, Marion. I think that the last 2 points you made are extremely important and very interesting. The one point on the fact that you cannot find any references to consumers on the WTO law. I think that also says something about the starting point for trade negotiations at the World Trade Organization, which have historically been from the perspective of obviously governments and therefore regulators, with very little consideration to
producers.
And producers. Because of lobby and many other reasons. But consumers have been left out. That is, it is almost a mathematical fact. I think I could say that safely, without getting killed by anybody. And that is perhaps something that it is changing. There is actually a very interesting paper, maybe a book now, by former DG of the WTO, Lamy, on what he calls the old economy versus the new economy. And to a large extent, that conversation is about moving or shifting from a producers and a regulators-oriented rulemaking framework into one that really pays attention to consumers, that shifts in that direction. So I thought that was quite interesting. That said, now we're going to move to the regional perspectives. One from Africa, one from China. And on top of sharing with us what the experience of Nigeria is or has been, and what do you expect, what do you see happening in the future of e-commerce in Nigeria, Constance, I think it would also be interesting for you to maybe make a reference to the role of Nigeria, both regionally and perhaps also at the WTO, in terms of building governance on e-commerce. Please.
Yeah, I think I started with the ease of doing business because, like my co-panelist said, if you can't even set up your business properly and run it well, without too much difficulties, it becomes worse when you want to go online. So, for instance, having broadband, affordability, e-payment systems, if you don't have that, it's very difficult to move forward in that space. And so what we are doing as a government is to see this area as a place where you have to provide the tools that the people need in order to do their business. When you come to Nigeria, it's a very big market, and our young people are already doing a lot in e-commerce. There are currently 150 million active mobile users in Nigeria. Some people might say that this doesn't matter, but for us, 20 years ago, we didn't have this. So that means that a lot of people are able to conduct their businesses, through their mobile phones and make some e-payment as well. And over 60% of these people are connected. they may not be connected throughout the day, so that is related to issues of affordability, which is why we're also focusing on making sure that we provide the broadband penetration that is deep enough in order to help them do businesses. We have about 17 million Facebook users in Nigeria, and in West Africa alone, Nigeria is home to some of the biggest online platforms, such as Iroko TV. There's hotels.ng, there's Jobberman, there's Andela, there's Balogun Market, there's Trooper.com, and a lot of them out there. Whether we regulate, whether we support them or not, these businesses are going on and doing what they need to do. But we think as a government that when you come in and try to provide the systems that will enable them, you even help you even help the explosion in a way that creates more jobs for the country. Coming to the regional angle, we are aware that a lot of African countries are hesitant in joining the e-commerce train, and there are divergent views on that. People have different concerns and worries. It will be, I think, not correct to wave them away. Some of them have genuine concerns, but as a country, we believe that you should definitely engage. And we believe that whatever aligns with our national interest of creating jobs, of helping businesses, that is the way to go. And that is why, whether it's in ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, or on the African continent, we've tried to, as much as possible, to engage with countries and discuss and see how we can sort of build a consensus on what is necessary for us to build the situations that are good for our businesses or our young people to engage in the e-commerce world. So I'm going to give another instance of where we think that consensus building will help us. So for instance, in Africa, we're currently negotiating the Continental Free Trade Agreement, and Nigeria is taking a leadership role in the CFTA. We chair the negotiating forum. And we see that as very important because somebody has to own something. There has to be ownership. There has to be leadership, and that is where we also see that we can play a role when it comes to e-commerce. If we're able to, as a continent, move together as a bloc and sort out the domestic issues that we need to deal with. Because before you go globally, we all have structural reforms that need to take place within our countries. So when we talk about the ease of doing business, World Bank ease of doing business, we are not doing it because of the World Bank. We think that these are things that are necessary for us to grow our economies. And that is why at the CFTA, we've very much worked with all the African countries to see that we come to a close. This year has been very successful. The negotiations have gone well. We're hoping that by next year, maybe middle of next year, we will have a document ready for the African governments, heads of states, to sign. And when it comes to e-commerce, it's not easy. It's a very difficult conversation within Africa. Kenya has a different view. Rwanda has a different view. South Africa has a different view. When you sit in the same room, it's complicated. However, we think that when you continue to have those discussions and you continue to listen to different countries, there are different levels of development. Some are higher, some are lower. So you have to take that into consideration, definitely. And that is the position we've taken as a country, that yes, we will follow the things that align with our national interests. However, we also have to bring along other African countries, because if there is prosperity in Nigeria, and there's no prosperity in, for instance, the West African region, it affects us as a sub-region. So we are interested in a situation where everyone benefits, everyone understands how it impacts their economies. Some countries are so weak that they don't even have the financing or the technical capacity to negotiate. They don't have competent people to do that for them. So these are areas where we sit down and we discuss, which is also somewhere where technical capacity can come in. But some of the countries need to really persuade them. It's an act of persuasion. You need to persuade them to see how this is good for them in the long run. We definitely, as a country, know that whether you engage or not, the e-commerce train is moving, and it's going to leave you behind. And I agree with you that a lot of countries, some may be ahead, but a lot of countries are dealing with this e-commerce area in this 21st century. Is new to everybody. So not everybody understands the details, but the point is we have to talk about it. And in Nigeria, we are talking about it because we know that you cannot leave it alone. So that's sort of our strategy. And it ties in nicely into our strategy of diversification. We want to diversify. For the past 50-something years, a lot of our revenue has come from oil. So we also see e-commerce as an area where we can diversify and create jobs in the private sector rather than most of the population depending on the government for jobs. That's the way that we see it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Constance. Your last words reminded me of an intervention by a Chinese representative about a month ago in Nigeria, in Abuja. Now, the topic was a different one. It was investment facilitation. And the Chinese representative, what he said was sort of like this. He said, we know that not everybody can join this initiative at the WTO at this point. We're also aware that there are a number of members out there who may consider joining. And in response to that, we will wait. We will wait for anyone who wants to join. However, markets are cruel and they will not wait. And that is something that I think it's either implicit or very explicit in your message, and I think it's a powerful message for everyone. Now, moving to China, Hong. Well, the Chinese case is always different. Simply because China, in its magnitude, has a gravitational pull within the Asian region and within the world that very few other economies have. So whatever China does or doesn't do echoes beyond the borders of China. And as China becomes an ever more relevant player in the digital economy, not only domestically, but also beyond China, this question, I think, becomes ever more relevant.
I think China's at this moment is mainly a domestic player, and also e-commercial development is mainly domestic phenomena. So I think what the China had done well and is e-commercial is something. It's only part of the development processings and a part of the industrialization processings. And it's a long processing, almost for 20 years from the 1990s when the internet is come up. And at that time, I remember a lot of the encouragement from government to support for example, for the some of the internet firms, for example, for the Xinlang is and also Sohu is some of the gate internet firms at that time, and also go to the United States to the public, and then have a lot of the investment for the telecommunications infrastructures, and not only for the e-commercial or internet, but also for telephone and for cables. And they have a lot of the benefit for the follow-up development for the e-commercial development for that. And also as well, a lot of the, for example, for some of the programs to connect every village in China to cables and then to internet. So have a lot of the it's positive impact for the local people, especially all over China, not only for the city, but also for countryside, to connect it to the internet. And then when the e-commerce come up recently, so a lot of the people can get integrated in these processings. And also, of course, we have some of the big firms like Alibaba to be e-commerce value chains, like a systematic integrated. Like, for example, other value chains is, for example, for the automobile, we have the components and parts firms, and also have the systematic integrated there. But for the e-commerce firms, platform is very important. This is like systematic integrated, not only for the one value chains, but for a lot of value chains. So this is very important, and what China has done well, we want to have some of the regulations, not for the others, but targeted for the systematic platform. This is most important. For example, for the Alibabas, we want to have, for example, some of the qualities to sell by the Alibaba's platforms. Yeah, how the consumers to get the bite or the guarantee for the quality of the goods from this platform to buy. Mainly the responsibility is for the Alibaba, not for the small and middle firms. So this is something we want to do, and also is some of the solutions for the regulation for this new development. Yeah, and also I think another issue is that it's in China for the e-commerce development is that it's only part of our whole development processes. And also we know in the past, especially famous Russia economist is Goshen Kron discussion about the later comes countries to catch up with leaders. The theory is that look at what's the missing conditions compared with the leaders, then do a lot of things to make up these missing conditions and then catch up. But for the e-commercials, I don't think it's a very efficient solution for that. We must have the long processes, and e-commercial development is only part of that. And you cannot want to development only for e-commercial models, and then investment for the infrastructure and a lot of things for that. It's only a small part of the development processing for that. And China's is almost for 20 years when these results come out. Yeah, and lastly, I think for the now for the spillover of the Chinese firms or commercial models, it's at this moment I just mentioned at the beginning is only the domestic development. And we have some of the firms have some of the engagement or investment in the neighborhood Asian countries. What they've done is mainly to reproduce what happened in China.
Right.
Yeah, so they want to find local partners there. And for example, Alibaba have some joint venture with Indian firms to do some of the e-payment for that. Yeah, and also others as well. So for the global, in the global market, I don't think at this moment is a big player for that, because this e-commercial revolutions is still and the processing now in China, not yet have some big result or spillovers for other countries.
Fantastic. Yeah. Thank you, Hong. Before I open the floor, let me pick up on one thing you said that I think is quite interesting, and acknowledging that individual experiences cannot most of the time, not always, but most of the time, be perfectly replicated in other jurisdictions, in other countries. There's one interesting element in the Chinese approach, which is that it is an approach. It is a strategy. China seems not just to be reacting to an overwhelming reality of e-commerce growing everywhere, but China has had a plan, has had a strategy that is larger than e-commerce, and e-commerce being a part of that national development strategy. And I tend to believe that that's probably one of the reasons why China has thus far been able to be very successful. That said, and acknowledging that we have about 15 minutes left, I'd like to open the floor for questions. So will you please raise your hand, then a microphone will reach you, and please state your name and your affiliation. The gentleman on the left, then the two young women on the right, and one in the back as well.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ibrahim Diagne. I'm from Senegal. I'm currently the chair of African Performance Institute and also managing director of the Single Window of Senegal. My question is, for many, in the beginning of e-commerce, it was about business concepts, but only Amazon emerged because of the condition of the market in the US. The second generation of e-commerce in the year 2000, it was about technology. But also we see that only Facebook and Google emerged because of the context of the market of the US. And the third generation is the one we are talking now. We have Alibaba emerging. But I think that now we have business concept available, we have technology available, and we have also the market available. But the thing is, at the departure line, I'm talking for African countries, the data, which is a critical element for the control of e-commerce, is not available in Africa. Facebook has more information on the society of my country, Senegal, maybe 100 times more than the official of Senegal. And the challenge of data not being available in Africa and also the regulation about data is a big challenge for the future of the e-commerce for the developing countries. And I would like to know what is your perspective on it. Because if I take a simple example, if I want to book an hotel in my country, Senegal, I'm sitting in Senegal, I'm booking through Expedia in the US for rooms that is available in my country. And all the value add is staying in the US instead of staying in my country. Because the data are available, big data is available in the US, and they exactly know where I am, what I want to do. So for me, it's a big challenge, and I would like to know quickly what you think about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies on this side of the table, please.
Thank you. My name is Dr. van Rensburg, and I'm from Northwest University, South Africa. Just thank you for the panel, very insightful discussions. My question is addressed to Pierre and Marion, but before I get to the question, I just want to provide some context. When South Africa prepared for the MC11 negotiations and the topic on e-commerce, we were fortunate enough to attend those preparations. And one thing that came out is, yes, there is definitely a fear when it comes to this topic. And Pierre, you say that the fear results from its link to world domination. But what we have realized from an academic side was that a lot of the fear comes from this topic being so unknown to our policymakers. I mean, we had so many discussions on this, and very, you know, the level of understanding when it comes to this topic on a trade policy level is just, so we would like to know that. And then rulemaking, Marion, you mentioned that it's new to everybody, and I think a lot of the fear also comes into, it's linked to that. So my question is, how do we support trade policy or trade policy makers to for them to inevitably come up with a sort of an enabling or a support system for the whole rule-making dilemma, because we won't progress on this if we don't provide education, communication to them, maybe capacity building, but how do we do this?
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Vanessa Santos from the Ministry of Planning in Brazil, and thank you for the brilliant panel. It's a great exhibition. I'll actually make a question that advances a bit on the questions made by the representative of Senegal. And when you're talking about the digital economy and you're talking about platform effects and network effects, they all exist in economic theory and they all have been there, and you're already talking about consolidation of markets, it's all known. But when you go to digital economy, it all seems a lot more amplified. And we're talking about data, that's so much important, because I think part of this fear comes from not knowing how to rightly grasp the best share of this digital economy. What I'm saying is, for instance, when you have the platform effect, and Kati was talking about how Internet of Things is making logistics and transport a lot more efficient, but I know that the transport companies are gaining, the users and the consumers are gaining, but probably the most part of the share is going to the owner of the platform who is providing the services. And this data gives advantage for the platform to provide new services because they know what the potential demand is, and how can you have national platforms with outside of specific niches, and you have that in Brazil, for instance, when you talk about fintechs. It's an amazing job they're doing it, but they're in a niche. There's probably some restraints that kind of make it difficult for outside companies or other platforms going to Brazil, and then you have the business flourish. Of course, I'm not saying that there is a responsibility from the government. Like Constance was saying, we need to do our housework and make sure that all businesses thrive, and that includes e-commerce platforms. So I would like to know how you can make sure that part of the value that's being produced in the digital economy also is grasped by the population and the community of the countries.
Thank you very much. I believe there's one more question in the back of the room, and we will close there simply because we'll have 10 minutes for speakers to run through all of the questions, all very interesting and very difficult to completely address in 10 minutes.
Hi, thanks for the panel. My name is Renato Monteiro. I'm a university professor in Brazil in cyber law.
There's so many Brazilians.
Yes, that's a good thing, I guess.
Yeah,
yes.
Otherwise.
Yesterday on the panel from the Friends from E-commerce, the word privacy was only mentioned once. And it was only mentioned by saying that privacy might be a barrier to trade. So my question is a very objective one. Should privacy be considered a barrier to trade or not?
May I just ask you, were you at the Dataflow session today early at 9?
No, I had a meeting with the Brazilian.
You missed that one.
Yeah.
It was all about
it was on my schedule. I missed that. I'm going to see the video afterwards.
Thank you. Okay, so what I've got in my notes is that the first question was basically addressed to everyone, unless it was addressed to me, but I'm the moderator, so I'll let speakers to take over. The second question by the lady here was directed to Marion and Kati, perhaps? Marion and Pierre. And the third question is an open one to anyone in the panel who wishes to go on. So we'll go with you, Pierre, first, if you wish.
Okay, yeah, sure. I think there are real issues of market concentration that are troubling. And the digital economy seems to have network characteristics that make it a first mover advantage economy, winner take all economy. There are some properties to market concentration in the digital sphere that raise very profound issues for competition law that competition authorities are still very much grappling with. More so, I would say, in the United States than in the EU. The EU has been much more assertive in expressing concern about the level of market concentration. The United States, with its emphasis on consumer welfare, tends to say, in response to your Expedia question, well, why would you care where the data is if you have your hotel room at a good price? And U.S. antitrust law has been ideologically driven by consumer welfare considerations first and foremost, and therefore perhaps expressing lesser concern about levels of market concentration or market dominance, abuse of dominance positions. But I think, we have a reality in the digital marketplace of levels of market concentration that in other industries we would never tolerate. And are we tolerating it because they are American firms? And U.S. antitrust says, well, it's American firms that are leading. Let's not break them up. There are some difficult issues there that I think need further scrutiny, certainly. Who owns the data? Who controls the data? Where is the cloud? Who owns the cloud? These are, again, very, very fundamental questions of ownership, access to exploitation of data. And it goes both all the way to, of course, considerations and concerns over privacy. If we have ever negotiations on these issues, this is going to be one of the toughest issues, because you have a deep ideological divide between some countries, particularly the United States, that tends to consider data as a valuable commodity that has commercial value that should be traded freely, and then other countries, for all sorts of different reasons of history, culture, approaches to regulation, that consider that the cursor should be placed somewhere in between to allow internet freedom up to a certain degree. And we saw that very vividly in the TTIP negotiations, the interrupted negotiations, transatlantic negotiations. We saw that in TISA. We didn't see it in the TPP because the US was so strongly holding the pen, I would say, in those negotiations, and Europe was not party to that conversation. And I think a lot of the Asian countries were probably not capable of offering a counter-narrative on those issues. So the point I'm trying to make is that even if we got to the point of a negotiating mandate on e-commerce in the WTO, don't expect negotiations on these issues to conclude anytime soon. They're going to take a very long time because of the sheer complexity of some of these issues and finding a point of equilibrium that balances these competing objectives and competing policy concerns. One of the answer, of course, is to say, if you're concerned about where the data is and who controls it, is to say, I want to impose some degree of localization on the data. And of course, the industry and the US government would say, of course not. There must be complete elimination of localization requirements, a provision that we find, not surprisingly, in the TPP. I happen to think personally that there are legitimate reasons, for consumer protection reasons, for domestic regulators to have domestic access to data. But the way in which you frame the localization requirement can be extraordinarily onerous and therefore, in effect, a disguised restriction to trade, or can be trade facilitating but still sensitive to domestic regulatory objectives. So again, we're back in the province of necessity, proportionality, and so on. Super, super complicated issues. And finally, on privacy, I think I answered the question. I mean, this issue is central to any conversation on digital trade, and you have starkly opposing views, I would say ideological views, on what to make of data and where to place the cursor in terms of protecting consumers and their personal data. So I'm under no illusion that we're going to have any quick answers to this anytime soon. Now, again, I finish with one point, which yes. Saying yes to a negotiation, if we ever get there, doesn't mean saying yes to the negotiated outcome. And again, I caution developing countries to remain very deeply entrenched in their opposition to negotiations because they forego the very significant learning that would be involved in what is going to be a long negotiating journey. A journey that is sufficiently long in time that many of the bottlenecks are going to be addressed. Many of the answers that don't seem clear-cut from the outset will find answers over time. And again, by staying on the sidelines, you forego all of that learning, and you still remain capable at the end of the negotiation to say, you know what, this deal is not in my interest. And we are in a consensus-based regime in which countries are sovereign in saying yes or no to negotiated outcomes.
Thank you, Pierre. We're really tight on time, so I'll go directly to Marion.
Yeah, I would like to start with the fear question, and with the, in doing this, would like to distinguish two types of fear. Fear in the population and fear among policymakers. I believe I see a big risk for the coming years in the fear among the population of these new technologies. In Europe, we have seen voting outcomes driven by fear of globalization. If we are now hit by fear of technology, I think this can be give outcomes that can be of concern. Now, the government, policymakers also have a fear of the unknown, fear of what to do. But the governments also have, in my view, an obligation of managing the fear of the populations. So like Constance, I think you have to take it up. The technologies are going to come. They are there already. You have to take this challenge up and deal with it. How to do it, that was your question. Here are maybe 4 things I would like to say. First, old rules and understandings of traditional economics continue to apply. We mentioned network externalities, information asymmetries, resulting market power. These things will also apply to the new economy. Let's not let it be discussed away. So it does matter who has the data. It does matter who has the information for the outcomes. These things have to be looked at. Second point, don't believe everything blindly that has a fancy name. If you're being told something is transparent but you don't understand it, then ask the question why it's supposed to be transparent. If you're told something is secure and you don't understand why, ask the question. Don't believe blindly, ask the questions. Third, be courageous in picking the difficult topics up. Be courageous in saying yes or no, because we have to move. And we have to start taking decisions. The economy is moving, the technology is moving. And fourth, it's very important to discuss cross-disciplinary and across different stakeholders. In particular in countries, and numerous countries where I've seen a lot of resistance on the policy side to deal with new technologies, some of these countries are characterized by vibrant private sectors in the same area. You have, in particular in African countries, small, medium-sized companies, very advanced, working with the newest technologies. Those people have to talk to the policymaker. Any regulation, any standard, be it in food safety, be it in chemicals, in pharmaceuticals, it has always been developed with the private sector. The private sector has knowledge that the policymaker from the outset doesn't have. That discussion is necessary and has to start as soon as possible.
Thank you, Marion. Constance,
yeah, just
very quickly, please.
Yeah, very quickly. So to the second question of the level of understanding in some countries is very little. I think that you still have to deal with it. So what we have done as a country is try to begin to attract country people from the diaspora who have been involved in this kind of issues. And that has helped us so much to, first of all, put down a strategy and then put down a timeline and the work plan. And, you know, they have lived in different countries, so they really have a deep understanding of what the issues are. They are competent negotiators, so they can help us and sort of guide us through the whole process. I think you just have to do that. And then to the issue of data, it's a very, very sensitive issue, you know, in Nigeria as well. I'm sure a lot of African countries. You're asking, where is this cloud? Where is my information? You know, and all of that. So again, you come to negotiation table, engage. So you have the, you know, the right or the space to say, this is what I can concede and this is what I cannot concede. Very difficult process, but at least be in it, have a voice, be on the table,
Absolutely.
and I'm sure you reach a middle ground somehow.
Thank you, Constance. Hong.
Yeah, it's I think a very good question is for the data issues. From a development perspective, I think this is like an old story of chicken and egg. Yes, I think, yeah, most important things is development. The e-commercial locally first. And then along this development, you can build your own data about the local community, local customs, and also local linkage, it's a market linkage. And gradually, and then more expanded and more data was built by yourself. And then you can link it with other, for example, for some of the big commercial platforms, and then you can link together. Yeah. So it's not a single data issues, but it's models and it's business issues. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And now, Kati, you have the pleasure of the closing.
Very good, very good. Thank you. Very quickly, it's absolutely the case. If I take the data issue as well, data is king. It enables companies to forecast, to optimize, to match, and so on. And I asked two questions when it comes to that: is should we deprive Ibrahima from using Expedia? I don't think he would benefit from that. I don't think any of his colleagues in Senegal would benefit from that. So, nor from using other competing platforms, Booking.com or Orbitz or what have you. And so I would start with the consumer in this case. And then also ask myself, well, is it fair to Expedia? Is it fair to these companies that have made significant investment or their investors that these data that they have is somehow monetized by others that don't have necessarily made any investment to generate it? So those are a couple of the things that come to mind. And these issues haven't quite been resolved in the United States either. I was just reading an article about how one company is scraping data from LinkedIn, which all of you are familiar with, and leveraging artificial intelligence to analyze that data and forecast to employers when an employee, a star employee, is about to leave a company, and then enable the employer to take some countermeasures and lure the employee to stay in the company. And there's a lawsuit between the two. LinkedIn brought a lawsuit, and it is losing. So the company that is scraping the data is still able to operate, but they've reached some kind of a middle ground where there's some co-monetization going on, where LinkedIn is going to get some benefit from this, and this will probably enable them not to appeal the ruling. So these are perhaps some of these issues that maybe in countries like Brazil, where you have fantastic technology companies and so on, that we could perhaps reach these middle ground solutions with both parties kind of pitching in there. And then, of course, we don't want to ask, well, how do we get piece of that data? But rather, how do we create our own ecosystem? I'm looking at two colleagues from Mercado Libre, which is a fantastic success story of Latin American internet company, started here in Argentina, and has done amazingly well, and is using data, I'm sure, amply. So the question should be rather, how do we catalyze more of those kinds of success stories? What can we learn? And I think, this region, Argentina and Brazil, certainly have so much going for them in this regard. In the agricultural sector, I've been amazed by the innovation of use of data in that area. Quickly on the privacy issues, I've been looking recently at the GDPR, the European Privacy Regulation, and a lot of countries are kind of toying with that and thinking about that, including in this region. And I would encourage everybody to look into some of the economic implications of GDPR. There are some analytics out there that calculate the cost for European companies from that regulation, that calculate the cost for European consumers as well, just from the lack of access to data that companies have as a result of the regulation. So, for instance, have to analyze credit for consumers and companies. So I think great care should be taken to think about restrictive privacy regulations. There's a lot of thinking that needs to be taking place clearly in this arena. It's a very charged topic, but there are significant economic downsides from restrictive data privacy regulations that will hit the consumer at the end of the day. So I'll conclude with that.
Thank you, Kati. And before we officially close, I wanted to, even if late, I wanted to excuse both Alvaro Cedeño, ambassador of Costa Rica, and Felipe Hees, counselor to the Permanent Mission of Brazil to the WTO. The fact that they're not here is probably a good thing, For many reasons, but I'll leave that to you to figure it out.
They're at the airport, actually.
Are they?
They're leaving.
I'm
kidding.
I'm
joking.
Anyways, thank you very much for coming, for taking your time. Wonderful questions.